Hello everybody and welcome back to our studies in AQA A-level politics, specifically UK politics. This lesson is going to be continuing our conversation about the various different electoral systems that are in place in and around the United Kingdom for whatever particular election that we're talking about. The previous video spent some time talking about the first past the post electoral system, the one that is used for general elections. This lesson is going to be talking about the supplementary vote, or SV. It's used in a number of elections across the United Kingdom, including mayoral elections, so elections to mayor, and also the elections for police and crime commissioners. These are often held during the process where you have local elections. So if you vote in your local election, which you should, everybody should, then you will also have the opportunity to vote for example, police and crime commissioners. It is a majoritarian system that is designed to ensure that the winning candidate not only gets a clear mandate, but is able to receive a broad level of support from the electorate. Now, it is attempting to essentially try and balance that principle against the idea of maintaining a certain degree of simplicity and straightforwardness when it comes to actually having the election itself. Now, we're going to do a detailed breakdown and an examination of the supplementary vote system in this lesson. Firstly, thinking about the key features, essentially how it works. We will also then give an example and sort of go through a particular example on screen. And then we will talk about the advantages of the supplementary vote system. And then finally think about the disadvantages, sort of critically assess the system of the supplementary vote. So the first question is then, how does the supplementary vote actually work? Well, the first thing that you should note is that unlike first past the post, this is an electoral system in which voters get two preferences. So in an election using SV, supplementary vote, voters are allowed to cast two votes for each candidate. So first is a preference, a first preference, and then a second preference. What you will do is you will mark an X next to your preferred candidate in your preferred preference section, and then you mark another X in a different for a different candidate as your second preference. Now, as the name suggests, the first preference is the candidate who the voter most wants to see win. So let's say, for example, let's say that we were doing let's say we had the supplementary vote for a general election. Let's say we reformed the UK's political election system, and now we use the supplementary vote. Well, when it comes to general election, let's say you are somebody who you like the Green Party. Let's say you're a progressive you care about the environment and environmental issues, but you also don't mind the Labour Party. The Labour Party are also progressive. They've also got some good issues, some policies on the issue of the environment, etc., etc. So with a supplementary vote election, what you would do is you would have a two preferences. Your first preference will be the Green Party. That is the candidate who you would want to see winning. And then you would have a second preference. This would be the backup choice. The backup choice in case their first preference, in case your first preference is eliminated and is no longer able to run in the election. Now, the good thing about SV is that voters aren't necessarily required to select a second preference if they don't wish to. Let's say you're an individual who just really, really, really cares about the environment and couldn't, in any good conscience, put a vote for any other political party other than the Green Party because they just don't have the right policy on the environment. If that was the case, then you don't have to. You could just leave that blank. If you do not wish to select a second preference, your vote will only count in the first round of counting. And this brings us to the second point. The second point is that there are two rounds of counting. There are two rounds of voting. This is a two-round system. The SV system is designed to ensure that the winner has broad support, ideally reaching a majority. And this is done through round voting system. So how does this work? Well, within the first round of voting, all first preference voters are counted. If the candidate in this first round of voting receives more than 50%, so if there is a candidate that receives more than 50%, i.e. a majority, they win outright. And that's it. That's basically the end of the election, okay? However, because there are obviously lots of different candidates, and in a lot of circumstances, there might not be a 50% majority in a particular election, well, in that case, then a second round of counting takes place. It's not a second round of voting, technically, because you've already casted 2 votes. It is just now counting the second preference votes. So the second round of counting takes place if no candidate wins a majority after the first round. The 2 candidates with the most first preference votes will then proceed to the second round. This is to ensure that there will be a majority when all the votes are finally cast. Because if there's only 2 candidates, unless it's exactly 50-50, one of them is going to get a majority. And so at this stage, all of the other candidates, are then eliminated from the ballot. They're eliminated from the voting and the counting. And at this point, all of the second preference votes from those eliminated candidates are added to the totals of the 2 remaining candidates. And so from here, voters who choose a candidate who has been eliminated in the first round have their second preference vote transferred to their second choice candidate. That's why it is known as a supplementary vote. And so the candidate with the highest total in the second round of counting will then win the election. Now, because there are only 2 candidates, this will often be, obviously, mathematically be a majority. So that's how we get the first round of voting and the second round counting process. In the event that more than 2 candidates are in contention after the first round, but all but the top 2 candidates are eliminated from the race. So it does not matter if you've got candidate C that is the third candidate that also has a significant number of votes, because they're not second, that means that they get eliminated. The eliminated second candidates' second preference votes are then redistributed to the remaining candidates. And what this process does is ensure that the winner has at least broad support among the electorate. And it also means that there aren't wasted votes, because if your vote went for a candidate that gets eliminated in the first round, then potentially your second preference might have gone to a candidate that doesn't get eliminated. And that therefore means you basically have a second chance for your say and for your influence to be made in a second round of counting. Let's then do an example then. Let's do an example. Imagine we have an election for a mayoral race or a police and crime commissioner election where there are 4 candidates. We have candidate A. Candidate A has 35% of the first preference votes. Candidate B has 30% of the first preference votes. Candidate C 20% and candidate D 15%. So we have the first round of counting, and this is for the first preference votes. And as we can see here, no one has a majority. There is somebody who has a plurality, which if it was first past the post, they would have just won. But in this case, they don't. Okay. And so what we see here is that nobody has a majority. So we then go to the second round. The second round means that the bottom 2 candidates are eliminated, leaving only the top 2 candidates left. So candidate A and B go on to the next round, candidates C and D get eliminated. And then what we do is that the voters who supported candidates D and C will then have their second preferences counted, and this will then be added to the totals of candidates A and B. So after the redistribution of the second preference votes, what happens then if we get a system where, let's say, candidate A gets an extra 15% of second preference votes from C and D, and then candidate B gets an extra 10% of votes from C and D? Well, what this would mean is that we then add those to the final totals. So the 45% from candidate A sorry, that's supposed to say 45%. 45% from candidate A, then goes and gets another 15%, at which point we end up with 60% from candidate A. And then we have, let's say, candidate B has an extra 10%, they get 40% in total, and that would be them getting not the majority, and therefore candidate A would win in the total. So just an apology here. This is supposed to say 45% of the votes. 45% of the votes would be there, not 35%. That was a typo there on my part. So bear that in mind when thinking about this back. But in this case, then, what happens is that candidate A would win because they would get 60% of the final vote after second preference votes are taken into account. So that's how it works. What are its advantages? Well, the first advantage is very clear. The first advantage is that it ensures that there is broad support for the winner of a particular election. The supplementary vote system ensures that the winning candidate has the support of the majority of voters. This is unlike the first past the post system, in which a candidate could win theoretically with a plurality of votes. The SV system requires that a candidate win over a larger section of the electorate. It is more simple than a process in which you would require a full runoff voting system. So in some parts of the world and in some elections, you have what are known as runoffs, which is essentially a two-round system in which you do voting, and if there is no clear majority, then you have to do another round of voting afterwards. Now, this is very similar in the sense that there are technically two rounds, but there's only one round of voting. You vote twice in this first round, and then you do 2 rounds of counting. It makes it more efficient, and it makes it less costly. Voters only need to go to the polls once, and the counting process is relatively straightforward. It also encourages positive campaigning, because since voters have the option of choosing a second preference, candidates are incentivized to appeal not only to their core supporters, who they know they're going to get the votes from, but they might also have to appeal to the voters who they want to have as their second preference. And so this reduces negative campaigning, because candidates then seek to garner second choice votes as well. So they're trying to garner as much of the electorate as possible. It also reduces the need and the impact for tactical voting. If you have 2 options, unlike first past the post, then you are able to express a preferred candidate and maybe a backup candidate if that preferred candidate doesn't get through. It means that you can support your ideal candidate without worrying that by doing so you are supporting a candidate that was likely not win and therefore wasting your vote. You can support your ideal candidate, the one that you're ideologically aligned to, even if you are worried that they won't win, because then you have the backup, you have the second preference. You might go, well, this is the candidate that I'd like to win, but I don't think it's likely, so in second place on that, I would like to vote for this candidate who is more likely to win. So this reduces not only the need for tactical voting, but it also reduces the impact that tactical voting would even have on the electoral process. Tactical voting will often occur when voters feel that their preferred candidate has little chance of winning. Well, if you've got a sort of backup count, a backup vote with the 2 voting system, then that doesn't necessarily matter too much. And then finally, for advantages just like that of first past the post, the SV system also can prevent extremist candidates from winning the election. The system ensures that extreme candidates who might win a very small but nevertheless vocal minority in the first preference of votes are still nevertheless less likely to win, since they need to have a support from a broad range of voters to even get to the second round and then to even win in the second round. So that is, again, it makes it more difficult for all parties to win an election, and that also obviously includes the extremist candidates as well. Finally then, what are the disadvantages of the SV system? Well, there are limited preference voting, okay? So while the SV system allows voters to choose a first and a second preference, unlike other systems that we will get to in future lessons, it doesn't allow you to rank all candidates in order of preference. So even though this is a much greater amount of voter choice than first past the post, where you only get one vote, it is a much lower amount of voter choice compared to, for example, ranked choice voting, or the single transferable vote, STV, where voters can rank all their candidates. Some argue that this limits the ability of voters to fully express their preferences. Let's say you're really into your politics, and hopefully you are if you're studying A-level politics, and you decide that you really want to express an opinion about all of these candidates. Well, you can't with SV. You can only pick a preferred and then a backup, and that's it, really. And if you've got an election in which you've got maybe 6 or maybe even 7 candidates, that gives you quite a limited amount of voting potential compared to STV, for example, or ranked choice voting. But it gives you more, nevertheless, than the limited voting preferences when it comes to first past the post. Now, you do have a problem of wasted votes also in the SV system. Voters, for example, who choose a candidate who is eliminated in the first round, but who also don't indicate a second preference, or maybe even indicate a second preference that is also eliminated in the first round. Well, what they do there is they've essentially wasted their vote. That vote is therefore completely meaningless and useless and does not contribute to the final tally. These votes are not counted at all in the second round. If you don't indicate a second preference, or your second preference is a vote that has also been eliminated, then you can't. It has no impact on the final decision to elect a particular candidate. This will then disenfranchise voters who do not have a clear second choice, or do not want to support a less preferred candidate. And that can be problematic. What if you, like I said in the earlier part of this lesson, what if you just really, really like the Green Party and you couldn't stand to vote for any other political party because none of them go far enough on environmental politics? Well, then you're not going to have much of a say when it comes to the second round of voting if the Green Party then get eliminated. Just like first past the post, the SV system is also not proportional. It means that essentially that the number of seats or positions a party or a candidate wins does not necessarily reflect the overall vote that they received. This can obviously, just like with the first past the post system, it can lead to situations where a candidate wins a race by a narrow margin despite not receiving a majority of the vote. The penultimate issue that you've got here is, of course, that it's a little bit more confusing than first past the post. SV is simpler than some of the runoff systems, and it's more simple than STV, which we'll get to in the next lesson. But voters might still be confused about how their vote works, because some may misunderstand the system. They might not cast a second preference, and therefore leave their vote to be wasted if the first preference is eliminated. And others might just feel unsure about who to choose as their second preference. A lot of the time, if we were to apply this to general elections, people and voters really struggle to think about who they're going to vote for in a general election. So how can SV make it any better? Because at that point, what you're saying is that, well, not only do you have to go through the arduous task of trying to pick a preferred candidate, but you also have to then repeat that arduous task to try and pick a backup candidate. That might be quite difficult and quite confusing for a number of voters. One of the things that is good about the first past the post system is that democracy requires simplicity and ease of understanding. And first past the post is very good at that, whereas SV is a little bit more confusing, however, not as confusing as some of the more convoluted runoff systems and single transferable vote, which we'll get to, like I said, in the next lesson. And then finally, you have less representation for smaller parties. While supplementary vote tends to encourage broader support, it also tends to favour larger parties and candidates. Because what tends to happen is people will have their first preference vote, which might be more likely to be a smaller or fringe party, but then their second preference vote will be a more mainstream and more generally popular and generally accepted party. So, for example, I very much care about the environment, I care about progressive politics, so I'm going to vote for the Green Party. But that's a fringe political party, it only gets 1 or 2 seats in Parliament every single election. And so, as a sort of backup, I'm going to vote for Labour as well. So I've got my fringe party, I've got my much smaller party, and then my second preference takes me to the more general popular political party. And when you've got smaller or fringe parties that struggle to gain significant traction, this makes them less competitive for second preference votes, and so it has a problem of essentially having less representation for smaller parties. The sort of advantage and disadvantage that goes hand in hand with this is that, yes, on the one hand, it's an advantage because it will essentially reduce the likelihood of extremist parties getting wielding any kind of political power. But the sort of flip side of the coin is that means that it's less representation for smaller parties. Okay, these electoral systems don't directly target small parties that are extremist. They just they might directly disenfranchise small parties, and that happens to include parties that are extremist. So it's a sort of double-edged sword there, sort of an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. So, to just generally wrap things up and to conclude this lesson, the supplementary vote system is a majoritarian voting system. It is designed to ensure that the winning candidate has broad support across the entire electorate. The way it works is that you allow voters to select a first and a second preference, and if no candidate wins a majority in the first round, then the second preference votes are then redistributed to the remaining candidates. It offers the advantages of being relatively simple compared to other electoral systems, but still a little bit more complicated than first past the post. It allows for you to ensure broad support for the winner, and it can reduce tactical voting. However, its drawbacks include the limited voter preferences compared to STV or ranked choice voting, and the potential for wasted votes and a lack of proportional representation. So, like I said, the next lesson is going to be talking about STV, which refers to the single transferable vote, a more proportional representative system, and one that is used for local council elections, elections to Northern Ireland Assembly, as well as to the European Parliament elections prior to Brexit.